When last we left Sonic, Yorkshire Tea and I had just completed Sonic Generations. The 2011 game was a wonder in many ways, with interesting challenges for Sonic in 2D and completely tremendous 3D stages that both gave a real sense of speed whilst providing some tests with routing and reaction time. For a moment, it felt like Sega had finally solved the problem of Sonic in 3 dimensions. 3D stages focused around speedrunning, but of a length long enough that players could get used to the new mechanics each stage introduced, alongside 2D stages with multiple routes and paths, allowing players to explore and gain a sense of the old-school Sonic magic. The convenient choice to mitigate the huge amount of work that boost stages took, with gameplay that was beloved by the fanbase, seemed like the final block of a puzzle, and in 2011, it felt like we were due for a renaissance of the Sonic franchise. Sega had other plans. Sonic Lost World released in 2013. In a strange but somewhat characteristic choice by Sonic Team, they had abandoned the boost gameplay they had spent a decade perfecting in favour of a new model. Lost World seemed to strongly take inspiration from Super Mario Galaxy, the breakout Mario title from 2007, which placed Mario in a world of spherical planets and platforms, causing the force of gravity to alter as he moved from one to another. Sonic's speed, however, meant that his transition to this behaviour required some changes. Instead of planet-like objects, Lost World was populated by massive cylinders that Sonic would circle around. The result was mixed. Whilst Lost World had a strong visual design, the levels themselves were confusing to navigate, and Sonic's speed meant that precision platforming was more difficult than it needed to be. But the removal of boost meant that he also didn't feel fast enough on the ground. In the end, Lost World did little for the franchise, reinforcing the stereotype of the Sonic cycle once again. And with that, Sonic Team went back to the drawing board. For 4 years, Sonic went dark, with very little being reported from Sega. But plans were brewing that would change the perception of the series forever. Christian Whitehead, also known as the Taxman, had been working with Sega for nearly a decade, starting as a fan modder, but transitioning to creating ports to the iOS for Sonic the Hedgehog 1 and 2. His major achievement was a near-perfect replication of the physics from the old games, a feat that had eluded Sega themselves for years. In 2017, the Taxman was put to the test, as Sega released the first new mainline 2D Sonic title since Sonic 4 back in 2010. To describe Sonic Mania as a triumph is an understatement. It is possibly the best realization of Sonic to have ever been released, with physics that nearly perfectly resembled the original games, but with level design that iterated on the old and introduced the new. To this day, I consider Press Garden to be the finest stage ever made in Sonic, and it speaks to the quality of Mania's development team when you realize it was an all-new stage made specifically for that game. Mania delighted Sonic fans, and the add-on, Sonic Mania Plus, released the next year, was just as much of a revelation, adding new characters and remixing stages for a fresh playthrough. It was thought that Mania's success commercially and critically might herald a new wave of retro-style Sonic games, that perhaps this time Sonic Team couldn't miss. This, unfortunately, would be proven wrong. In the same year, Sonic Forces released. In a strange move, Sonic Team reverted back to a version of the Generations formula, reintroducing classic Sonic alongside modern Sonic. But in what might have been a brilliant decision at that point in time, Sega introduced a third character, a resistance fighter that could be customized by the player. The idea of creating an OC for a Sonic game was genuinely very well received, and there was promise in the premise of Sonic Forces, with Sonic finally having been defeated and perhaps new heroes having to rise in his place. But the hype died with the game's release. Forces received an incredibly mixed reception, with critics citing that the modern Sonic stages were far shorter than they needed to be, and the classic Sonic stages lacked meaningful variable level design. Many liked the original characters they had made for Forces, but to me at least there was a clear problem. The Resistance Fighter stages were in 3 dimensions, and ran at almost the same speed as modern Sonic. It seems clear that Sega had recreated the problem of the boost era for themselves by tilting the skew of the game from half 2D, half 3D, to 1/3 2D, 2/3 3D. Stages couldn't afford to be long because of the huge burden that Boost Sonic and the Resistance Fighter would place on the game. Put simply, if your character moves at triple speed, you need triple the stage to accommodate for them. The result? Modern Sonic stages that were unsatisfactorily short, alongside very questionable platforming design, creating a game that could best be described as a very inconsistent experience. With Forces received to mixed reception, Sonic Team would once again return to hibernation. It's unclear why Sega never capitalized on Sonic Mania in the intervening period. Rumors have swirled from statements saying that Sonic Team weren't happy to have been upstaged by fans, to a clash between Sega of America and Whitehead's team at Evening Star Studios. But what can be said is that Sega missed an incredible opportunity to truly propel Sonic to the same heights he had achieved in the 90s. And with that silence, and a bit of a strange re-release for Sonic 3, we end up in 2022, with the release of Sonic Frontiers. Frontiers represents another attempt by Sonic Team to rethink the franchise. Taking inspiration from Zelda Breath of the Wild, Sega have placed the Blue Hedgehog in a massive open world. It's a bold direction to be sure, with initial previews resulting in derision from fans, claiming that it looked like a fan game in the Unreal Engine. But as demos got into the hands of reviewers, the reception became warmer, with high praise for how Sonic moved in his new world, as well as for the ambient sound and music. This is the point where T and I will be rejoining the series, with a highly experimental game seeking to tread new ground. Our experience with Sonic is varied. T, an incredible fan of the 2D era, whilst I remain an unapologetic lover of the Boost era as well, as hopefully our previous playthrough of Generations will attest. So what will we get when we take Sonic into this new world? Another disappointing game with ambition beyond its means? Or the beginnings of something really special? I, for one, am really excited to find out.